Oh, hello. I didn't see you there. Thank you for joining me. I'm Alex Mattress, and I will be presenting my book report. My book is Theater Audiences: A Theory of Production and Reception by Susan Bennett. Some details, as I stated, the title is Theater Audiences: A Theory of Production and Reception. The author is Susan Bennett, editor is none, translator none, and this is the second edition. So what this work is attempting to talk about is that she recognizes how theater audiences is a cultural phenomenon. She sees her subject throughout the entire book is a productive and emancipated spectator. She's concerned with the diversity of theater, which operates in contemporary culture and the different audiences they attract. When I think of contemporary culture, I think of the future of culture, the progression of it, and how with theater, when you think of culture as this overarching umbrella and theater being a part of culture, the contemporary of how contemporary theater is bringing in different art. So different theater is bringing in different audiences, and how that is all playing when it comes to culture. An overall summary of the book. I believe this quote really perfectly encapsulates what she's trying to talk about. Cultural assumptions affect performances, and performances rewrite cultural assumptions. The role of those productive and emancipated audiences occupies center stage throughout these investigations. So I think Susan Bennett recognizes that theater performances can be affected by those who are essentially putting that show on. So directors, performers, for the performance, production team, those who are making the performance are affecting that performance, but those who are coming to watch the performance are a totally different group of people. And so, so the performance can then in turn affect or change the perception, opinion, broaden the audience's scope. And so through these investigations, she's trying to better understand just how that happens, through the audience, how those cultural perceptions are being changed. This is a pretty dense book when it comes to material, so I will be focusing on chapter 3, culture and the idea of the theatrical event. There is a study that she covers by Frank Kupeters, May 1976. Ethnogenic research is based on the premise that the group is more than a number of individuals, but is instead a super individual having a distinctive range of properties. This is a qualitative research, not quantity research. Looks at the non-traditional theater and its problematic form of those traditionally researched audience. Comparative study, which combines a sociological breakdown of audiences with an analysis perception. So essentially what he did was he went to one theater, the People Show, they were putting on various performances, and so he went to one that was in the evening. He observed the audiences coming in, interacting with each other, sitting when they went into the theater to sit, watch the performance, that much more traditional setting. And then he went to a second performance where it was during the day. Audience members did not sit, they were able to stand, they walked around, performers interacted with them, they broke that fourth wall, and then he interviewed various patrons from both performances. His data consisted of approximately 1,000 pages of interviews, transcripts with the main audience, written impressions of, and interviews with 2 school classes, and collected newspaper reviews. So what does this method, this framework remind you of? Definitely reminded me of participatory action research, specifically when he was sitting back and becoming more observatory. It made me think of how they handled the Edible Museum. That researcher just kind of like, just let like free will happen, right? Had nothing to do with it. And also with the young people in museums, just how the framework of how he went through about that. It also made me think he collected firsthand experiences, and that was similar to how they did the information flows in a gallery work entertainment spaces. He also gathered criticisms from newspapers and stuff, similar to how they wrote their own criticism about the board. So he took firsthand experiences, he used his observation, and he took other people's written experiences, newspapers, and collectively he came up with these conclusions, these four main conclusions. One's attitude toward perception of relationship with the rest of the public is an important factor in one's theater experience. So yeah, definitely one's place in the public, social norms definitely play in how one responds in a theater environment. Number two, the perceptual processes in the theater are, among other things, a form of social interaction. Again, social norms, how one handles themselves in theater. It could be very similar to how one handles themselves in social settings and outside of theater environments. Inanimate objects can become personified and or receive such strongly symbolic loadings that any anxiety about their fate becomes a crux in the people's emotional experience. This was really interesting to me. I'm really curious to explore more where this came from. To me, it makes me think when you're watching a live performance, sometimes a mistake happens, and you can almost sense the trepidation of the audience, because they're not really sure if that was meant to be. Should they have laughed? Did they, if they dropped a cup, was that meant to be? And so it just makes me think of their how to put the audience at ease. And when something does happen, they are suddenly fixated on that problem, and it pulls them away from the overall theater experience. This brings me to the environmental theater goes against people's experiencing homogeneous group reaction. So when I think of, when you think of experimental or environmental theater, it makes me think of, when you buy, in a traditional setting, when you buy a ticket for a theater show, you're essentially buying a little piece of property, right? Your seat, E5 is your seat, that is where your butt is going to sit, and collectively we are all sitting in these same seats, and that seat is pointing us in the same direction of the theater. And so as a group, we should all be experiencing, hopefully the same thing. Obviously some people have a better view than others, as opposed to when you're in his second study, it was a much more immersive experience. So perhaps, they were doing Hamlet in a house, and they every room was a different scene, and so now the individual patron no longer has this one seat. They have the free will to walk around, to be able to touch, to talk to others, to make eye contact with the audience. And so it can definitely heighten that individual's theatrical experience, but it definitely takes away from this feeling of being a collective body and having a much more singular experience, because you're having a much more immersive performance. Which brings me to this quote: culture cannot be held as a fixed entity, a set of constant rules, but instead it must be seen as in a position of inevitable flux. Again, this book really specifically focuses on experimental or contemporary theater. And so when you think of culture, it's and we're always constantly redefining, I don't want to say negotiating, but reassessing what that means. It's best to keep a malleable mind when you're thinking about that. And so that also should apply to, if theater is part of culture and we need to keep a malleable mind to culture, then we need, in turn, if culture is theater, we must keep a malleable mind for what it means for the theater experience. What does this sound like to you? What article does this remind you of? Another hint, another great quote. The relationship then between culture and the idea of theatrical event is one that is necessarily flexible and inevitably rewritten on a daily basis. So again, keeping an agile mind frame when it comes to trying to pinpoint what it means for culture to be just that culture, and how theater plays in that culture. Again, what is this reminding you of? Culture and theater need to be flexible. It needs to be constantly malleable. It needs to be liquid. This quote solidifies the idea. These two quotes solidifies the idea of this quote. Culture is usually liquid. It needs to be able to fit in wherever it needs to. Maybe it's air, maybe or gaseous, or it becomes more solid. If nothing else, this quote is from Art Installation as Knowledgeable Assembly Curating Contemporary Art. It just solidifies the idea that culture is a liquid, and in turn, contemporary theater is also a liquid. It's very malleable, and therefore the audience must be malleable as well in order to accept those new ideas. Towards the end of the book, they discuss with some theater anthropologists, which I didn't know existed, theater anthropologists. They argue the impossibility of transcending culturally determined expectations. Such investigations inevitably contribute to the repositioning of culture makers to a broadening of our understanding of the theatrical process. Let's just look at culture makers. One can maybe say that they're just artists. What are culture makers? Artists. Sure, okay. Let's think more broad. I kind of see culture makers make me think of someone who has a more overall encompassing message that they're trying to say with a collective group of work. So maybe a museum curator or an artistic director, someone, an art mediator, someone who has a much more overarching message that they want to say, and instead of just picking really cool pieces or artworks or performances for a season, they think more of what does the culture or society or community need in this moment, and how can we best serve them? What can these pieces or performances really give them? And so what this quote is essentially saying is that if we're going to attempt to broaden the expectations of culture and through theater, then we also are going to expect these cultural makers to also broaden their expectations, and to help reposition the understanding of that. These two quotes, you might see them again. To look at itself, a society must cut out a piece of itself for inspection. To do this, it must set up a frame within which images and symbols of what has been sectioned off can be scrutinized, assessed, and if need be, remodeled and rearranged. Audiences have become aware of the event of theater as in some way important in socio-cultural process. So I saw these two quotes as a way of backing up my idea of possibly creating this new term, theater capital. Again, if we're seeing theater as part of culture, instead of seeing it as just an appendage, theater is an appendage of culture that is constantly changing and reevaluating and reassessing. Why don't, cut itself out for its spectrum. Why not treat theater as its own little cosmos? I mean, it really is, when you think it has its own economics, its own funding, its own, the people that go, theater goers are not always the same people who are museum goers, it has its own, body of viewers that, their own studies and universities. And so why not, see theater, instead of seeing theater as part of culture, why not cut that out and see theater performance, what does it say? Culture becomes aware of theater as social cultural process. In order to see it as a social cultural process, we need to set it aside from culture and see it as its own entity, so we can better assess and rearrange what that potentially how that potentially affects the social culture. So, in conclusion, contemporary emancipation of the spectator, the audience, role serves to foreground the diversity of dramatic art and theater practice in contemporary cultures. Again, it pretty much backs up everything I've been saying, in that, with audience, with the help of the audience, they are bringing more diversity to what theater has to give in terms of culture. So contemporary theater is contemporary culture. It's just another subsector. And so this book essentially is trying to better understand just the diversity that the impact that the audience have when it comes to diversifying this specific subsector of culture, which is theater. And so I think it did a good job. I mean, again, I'm still learning. It kind of brings me to why I chose the work and give your opinion on its value. I chose this work because I'm trying to kill two birds with one stone. I have to write a thesis paper, and I figured, why not choose a book that could aid me in writing my thesis paper. I've always been interested in theater. I think there's a huge problem right now when it comes to the development of progression of theater and where it's going. In order to better understand theater, you have to understand, who theater is serving, which is the audience. And so, it's like, how do we solve this problem? Well, let's really get down to the nitty gritty. It's the audience. I'm not saying the audience is the problem, but I'm just trying to better understand this problem from all angles, and the audience is definitely a huge angle. I mean, they bring in a lot of money, they have a lot of impact, social impact, opinion impact, now with social media impact. And I think, when I first got this book, in the very beginning of the semester, I started trying to read it, and I couldn't understand it. And as I've progressed in this class and better kind of honing my theoretical skills and understanding, I'm so sorry, I'm not used to talking this long. Better understanding those theoretical frameworks and how to see how to critique and analyze, I have a better appreciation of what this book is trying to say. I mean, I definitely would not have understood what empirical method or making meaning or reception theory, any of those things. And as we've progressed in the class, I definitely have grown to appreciate the value of this book. I think it has a lot of great resources, and I can't wait to keep delving into this book as I continue delving into my thesis, because I think this book can really, really help make what my thesis could potentially be, whatever it may be. So these are my references. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you.